close families. But if you could please now settle in for the speechifying and the official part of tonight. I'm Jane Polfreman from Allen and Unwin. Very lucky woman who gets to be Monica's publisher. And on behalf of us and Better Read Than Dead and Monica, welcome to the launch of Stranger Country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present and future, and I extend that respect to other Indigenous people who are here tonight. So we're here to celebrate and send out into the world Monica Tan's brilliant memoir, Stranger Country. Monica, thank you for entrusting us with your amazing book and for bringing such energy, passion, insight and heart to your work. I'm so proud to be your publisher, and everyone at Allen and Unwin is thrilled to be publishing Stranger Country. I'm also very proud to introduce another fearless, brilliant and inspiring woman tonight, the incomparable Mehreen Faruqi, Green Senator, career engineer and lifelong activist for social and environmental justice, the first Muslim woman to sit in an Australian parliament. Mehreen introduced the first bill to decriminalise abortion, forced the New South Wales government to disclose evidence of mass outsourcing of public sector work to do with WestConnex, and won a container deposit scheme and driver's licence suspension reform. Mehreen has been named one of the 100 most influential engineers in Australia, won the UNSW Faculty of Engineering Award for Leadership, and in 2017 was awarded the prestigious and sought-after feminist Edna Ryan Grand Stirrer Award for initiating others to change the status quo in her work to decriminalise abortion. Please join me in a rapturous welcome for the remarkable Senator Mehreen Faruqi.
Hi everyone. I will start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we gathered on, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. As you know, this land was never ceded. It always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I think while we acknowledge our First Nations people, it is really important to recognize that they still face the worst kinds of discrimination, disadvantage, and racism that exists in Australia. And really, it is up to us. It should be our first priority to stand alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people in their fight for justice, in their fight for treaties, and in their fight for self-determination. Well, I can't tell you how much of a privilege it is for me to be standing here and launching the amazing Monica Tan's beautifully written experience of Australia's peoples and its landscapes. Huge congratulations, Monica, and we are so, so proud of you. You know, Monica writes about belonging to a country when your family came from somewhere else, and about 60,000 years of the history of Indigenous Australians. A history which not many of us have seen or learnt about in depth and in the breadth that it actually deserves. I definitely did not when I came to Australia from Pakistan in 1992. The country I came to felt in many ways like an egalitarian society where ordinary people tended to be treated with dignity and respect. But the more I learned about Australia, the more I was troubled by its treatment of Aboriginal people. And what also troubles me is that there is a reluctance among so many of us to acknowledge that Australia is a nation built on the invasion and colonization of sovereign nations. And it surprises and saddens me that this fact is still denied, and often really vehemently. Stranger Country is such a valuable contribution to help raise this awareness, which perhaps is lacking because many of us have not seen country, nor experienced colonialism's exploitative, extractive, and violent impacts. And I would never, ever presume to speak for what colonialism means for First Peoples in Australia. But as someone who grew up in Pakistan, which was part of the British India, the British Raj, the British Empire, for many, many years, I am well aware of the bloody history and the legacy of conflict and war that is left behind and that continues on to this day. And here I do want to pay tribute to both Monica for writing this book and also to her previous workplace, The Guardian, for their role in documenting the killing times, the massacres of Aboriginal people Australia must confront. A series that examines the history of Aboriginal massacres that are rarely talked about, let alone taught. Knowing our history means knowing our truth. Our past directly informs our future, and truth really is the only way to confront our present as well as our future. And I must say, what really grabbed my heart and soul while reading Stranger Country is the way Monica has described history through geography, through land and through water. So well aligned with the Aboriginal concept of country and their connection to land and its spirituality. It also reawoke in me my inner nerd, the water engineer, as I read these uncanny descriptions that so very artistically painted pictures of water catchments and landscapes in my mind. And I do want to read a couple of the many such elegant pictures in prose from the book. So there's one here which talks about the Mungo National Park. It forms part of 19 dry lakes, once strung together by a channel of water, and is sandwiched between Mali trees and dune fields to the west, and the riverine plain I just driven through to the east. This area, geologically speaking, has long been quiet and stable. For thousands upon thousands of years, sediment washed out from the distant mountains and collected in the low-lying stretch of lakes like a sink strainer. I'm not sure about you, but it really does. If you close your eyes, it paints the beautiful picture of Australia and what many of us actually haven't seen. I haven't yet. And here's another one. In towns along the rivers that trickle from the mountains to the interior, the curling Murrumbidgee River converges with the Lachlan, running into the mighty Murray. Rainwater funnels off the Great Dividing Range into these all-important waterways and is carried to the long, flat western plains. And at a time where we are actually facing an ecological disaster that is unfolding in the Murray-Darling, the importance of looking after land and water, like Indigenous people do, cannot be overstated. For me, it's also a reminder of another country I still belong to, Pakistan, and especially the province I grew up in, which is called Punjab, which means 5 waters, because it is the land where 5 rivers meet and have been part of the cultural storytelling since time immemorial. Like Monica, I've also had a struggle with identity and belonging. As a first-generation migrant, the notion of place and identity has taken on quite a different meaning for me since moving away from a land where many, many generations of my family have lived and belonged to one which was completely new to me. I am definitely caught between 2 places, one from my origin and the other that I've adopted. I've now lived in Australia almost exactly as many years as I lived in Lahore. And as I grew and evolved, especially in such a multicultural place like Sydney, exploring my sense of identity became quite complex and even confusing at times. But what I have realized is that you can belong to and identify with more than one place at the same time. I can have the same love for the majestic Himalayan mountains in the north of Pakistan, which I frequently visited with my family when I was growing up. The same love as I have for the hinterland and the estuaries around the Hastings and Camden Haven rivers, in and around Port Macquarie, where I also lived for many years and where my 2 children grew up. This realization came quite strongly again as I went to Pakistan a couple of weeks ago to visit my mum for only a few days. The few days turned into a couple of weeks as I could not come back because of the mini war that has recently broken out between Pakistan and India. I spent much of the extra time reading Stranger Country and was surprised at myself at the longing and belonging I felt for Australia when I was not here. The concept of place is a physical and a psychological construct. I think quite inseparable from the people who live and interact in those places. The landscapes and environmental attributes and the feelings and emotions they evoke in you are part of the connection and the attachment. And these can develop only through our experiences of place. And what Monica has given me through writing the experiences and emotions of her travels through Australia is a taste of our vast country and a hunger to explore this place more. After reading just a few dozen pages of the book, I felt like getting in my car and totally submitting to Australia's unrelenting desolation, as Monica describes it. Because in failing, you risk going stir-crazy. So Monica, thank you for overcoming your fear of going west. Thank you for overcoming your fear of being bitten by a snake or of dying, and for giving up your permanent job to make this trip on a dusty road. By doing so, and by telling your story, you've made us all more wise about the history, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the incredible landscapes, the beautiful birds that live here, and much more about the place we call home. This is home for so many of us that come from somewhere else. It's always been home to Indigenous Australians. And it is our obligation to know our home and its history. Monica's journey makes you laugh, makes you cry, makes you dream. But most of all, it gives you hope. Hope for a near future where treaties, reconciliation, and sovereignty for First Nations people will be a reality. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone! Thank you so much for being here. I was not at all expecting this turnout. Many of you I almost forced to come here. I threatened you. I said I will never talk to you again if you don't come. So I guess it turns out bullying people actually works. So we've got an amazing turnout. So before I get started with introducing my amazing panel, I did want to have just a bit of an Oscars moment and say thank you to so many of the people in this room, without whom there's no way that this book would have happened, and there's no way I would have done half the things that I've done in my work. Of course, I firstly have to say thank you to my family. My dad has always been my biggest supporter. He's made sure half of Chinese Australia is in this room tonight. Shout out to Chinese Australia and the Chinese language media that are here tonight. I really hope that the messages of this book sort of reach that community, because we're the future. We're definitely part of the future of Australia. So I'm really grateful for all of you to have come here. I'd also like to thank all my friends who read sections of my book and gave me feedback. In particular, Catherine Ma and Jake. Where is he? Catherine and Jake? Anyway, they're over here. They were, I would send them 10,000 words and they wouldn't blink an eye. They had never had any complaint, and they gave me the most incredible feedback. It was a masterclass in writing. So thank you to them. Thank you to lots of people in this room who gave me feedback. Janine, and there are others who, sorry, I can't remember all of you right now, but you know who you are. Thank you to my agent, Grace. Thank you to my publicist, Brendan. Thank you to my editor, Jane, and everyone at Allen and Unwin. I've had such an incredible experience with my publishing journey. I know that lots of writers don't say that about theirs, but mine has been nothing but feeling supported and, you know, people getting behind me from that side of things, and just really caring about the work and being really sensitive to it, and you know, putting in just as much work and effort as I have. So when you see that, I'm just so incredibly grateful. Thank you to Better Read Than Dead, and thank you to the Vanguard for the venue and for, you know, helping tonight, you know, make sure that everything went smoothly, which I think it has. Thank you to Freya for that video. How wonderful was that? And, you know, I think there's also a long list of people who, wait, before I go there, thank you to the wonderful people on this stage with me as well who've offered their time. Bridie, who's, you know, also gave me an author endorsement. I will introduce you to this amazing woman in a second. Maureen and Mariko, thank you to the three of you. And thank you as well to, okay, this is the last thank you. There's, as many of you know, it's a really big year for me because I'm not only putting out a book, I'm running for federal parliament, and there's just like a whole bunch of people who have been a part of that and bringing up such a public chance to thank you. So I want to thank you as well. There's so many people from the Greens here today. Thank you so much for appearing today. Okay, so lastly, there's a whole bunch of people who, they're not in this room, but I must thank them, the people in the book. So most of the people in the book, of course, because the trip was not spent in Sydney, it was spent in the rest of Australia, and so there are people scattered all over the country who, you know, let me sleep on their couch, who, you know, spent a night around a campfire with me, and some of whom agreed to be in the book, even though that's a really difficult thing to do. So thank you for, even though none of them are here, thank you for giving me your stories and you know, believing that I would treat your stories with enough respect that it could be shared. So quickly about the book, it's called Stranger Country. I'm sorry if you didn't manage to get a copy. Please go to your local bookstore and ask them for it. If they don't have it, go, why the hell don't you have Stranger Country? Everybody's talking about it. Go to your library as well. Say the exact same thing. That would be amazing. If you have kids at school, tell the history teacher about it, because my dream is for this to end up on a school syllabus and for, you know, many year 11 students to be resentfully having to read it every year and write exams about it. So that's my dream. Keep it in mind. This was a very difficult thing for me to do because books are always difficult. I don't think it was exceptionally more difficult than any other book. I felt very vulnerable putting this out because there's so much of me in it, and it's very, you know, I think we're in somewhat of a difficult time to broach subjects like colonialism and race and whether we belong, how do you belong to a country like Australia with such a difficult history and such a multicultural society. We're living in very charged times, and it's not easy to decide to write a book that sort of explores that. But in the end, what kept me going was feeling that I had this incredible experience, this 6 months that I spent on the road, and over the course of that 6 months, I really fell in love with Australia. And I think, you know, the left and the progressive movement often underestimate the power of love of country and the feeling of connection and the importance of feeling there's something bigger than you, something more important than you, and you know, wanting to connect to that. So for me, as someone who was a diehard lefty, I would never have expected for me to come out of it realising just how much I love Australia and how much I care about this place and how much I want to be a part of the conversations that are going on about how we reconcile with First Nations people and how we reconcile with our history and with our land. These are difficult questions, and every Australian, no matter how long you've been here, no matter what your race, we all have an obligation to engage with history and engage with these very difficult subjects. So, yeah, that's the book. I now want to introduce these lovely women beside me. I'm going to start off with Radi Jabbour. She is the author of The Way Things Should Be. Please buy yourself a copy. There, it's at the front next to mine. She's the comment editor for Guardian Australia. You've seen her on The Drum. I've always thought of her as a bit of a wonder kind to some extent.
Mate, I'm 30 now. I'm not a wonder kid anymore.
And she's of Irish Lebanese heritage. You know, fairly recent, right?
Yeah, so my mum was born and raised in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so
during the
she's
Troubles.
First generation. You know, it's such an honour for me to have someone from The Guardian here, because The Guardian played such a huge role in sort of so much of what I came into this book already knowing, and it was because The Guardian was so supportive of my keen interest in covering Indigenous Australian stories, so I'm really grateful for that.
Mate, it's an honour to be here, and what a turnout.
So you all know Marine Faruqi. She's, of course, she emigrated from Pakistan, as she said. She's a civil and environmental engineer and a lifelong activist, and became Australia's first Muslim senator. So thank you, Marine, for being here. And thank you for that incredible intro to my book. I was really, really touched by that, and I think that's going to be one of the pleasures of having this book out, is hearing responses like that. So thank you. And we have Mariko Smith. She is a Wingara Mura, which means Teaching and Research Fellow and Associate Lecturer at Sydney College of the Arts, University of Sydney. She's also a First Nations Assistant Curator at the Australian Museum. She has Yuin Nation, Japanese and Anglo-Australian heritage. Thank you so much for joining us, Mariko.
Thank you.
She's also a neighbour of mine. She's from Aquarara Way. And of course, it's me. And I was born in Australia, born right here in Sydney. I'm a teacher. I work at the Greens, and my parents emigrated here from Malaysia. We're of Chinese heritage, and I'm really honoured to live and work and study on Eora, Darugin, and Guringai country. So the theme of tonight's panel is, what does it mean to be Australian in 2019? And this is sort of an obsession of mine, I guess you could say, and the book is really an exploration of that. How does someone like me, who ancestrally was here a really short time, how do I belong here? How do I have those feelings? How will I ever feel like anything other than an outsider in a country which has this most extraordinary story of a group of people who've had groups of people who've had connections to this place for 40, 50, sometimes 60,000 years. I want to start with Mariko, because she does some really interesting work at the Australian Museum. And just to set the scene a little, I want to talk about Scott Morrison. Some of you may know who he is. And he announced... We'll be really brief with this bit. Earlier this year, he announced a $6.7 million in funding for a replica of Captain Cook's famous ship, the Endeavour, to circumnavigate Australia over 14 months to mark 250 years of the British explorer's first voyage to Australia. Because there's so much history in my book, I just want to point out that didn't happen in real life. It didn't circumnavigate, but that's the idea for the voyage. So I want you to tell us a little bit about what the museum, what work you're doing with the museum on this.
Okay, well, I'm working along with First Nations curator Laura McBride on what we're calling at the moment the 2020 project. It is going to be First Nations-led response to the Cook anniversary that's coming up next year. So it'll be a temporary exhibition in 2020. So we started off with doing community consultations. So for the community to inform us what they want this show about that is going to be marking that 250th anniversary. So that's really significant, because all too often we get that sort of the hero cult status of Cook, and marked by things like statues, and that's just crazy. I can't even think to say about that. The Morrison the memorial. I can't even put to words about how just gobsmacked I am. And so this is really just monumental, if we want to use that word, about having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples tell their perspectives and tell their story their way. And so the community consultation, overwhelmingly the response is we want to hear about our stories, our resilience, our spirit. We don't want to hear about Cook. Cook means nothing to us, you know, it means nothing really.
Yeah, so just to sort of, you know, because we have such a whole lot of different kinds of people in this room, you know, Cook is one of the few well-known figures from Australian history, I would posit to say, one of the sort of mainstream figures, and he has sort of, you know, because of that, what has he come to symbolise in Indigenous Australia?
Well, when we did our survey, I mean, we were asking people what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of Captain Cook, and there was a lot of swear words. And that's, yeah, he represents a lot, it brings up feelings of anger, sadness, also frustration at, you know, the reception of how he is received by mainstream Australia. So I think, you know, what he represents is just really interesting because a lot of people seem to conflate the 1770 event where he explored the you know, the eastern coast of Australia, and a lot of people confuse that with 1788, you know, with the first fleet, where, you know, Cook, by the time the first fleet landed, he was dead, and he was only in Australia for such a short period of time, but he represents so much to mainstream Australia about the foundations and the beginnings of what we call Australia today. So it's, yeah, it's really thought-provoking.
I'm curious as to what the approach The Guardian might take next year with what might be Cook Mania, or perhaps, you know, on days like Australia Day or January 26th, how does The Guardian sort of approach such a day that is quite divisive in the Australian public's mind?
I think that one of the main things that we try to do is elevate Indigenous voices. Like, The Guardian doesn't see... We're an Australian media organisation, but we don't see ourselves as people who have to talk onto the masses or who know everything or who have the right take on everything. So when an event like that comes up, it doesn't really matter what you know, individuals in The Guardian think. It's about elevating the voices of the people who are actually impacted by this. And a huge part of Guardian Australia's work, I think one of our most important works, is elevating Indigenous voices and amplifying them and make sure that we're hearing them. Like, we report on it as well, obviously, but I think a mistake that a lot of media organisations and people can fall into is reporting on Indigenous affairs as an objective reporter and thinking that you're doing the right thing, or which you can be at times, and not realising the importance of actually amplifying the Indigenous voice. Like, it's not necessarily a white person isn't going to be the best person, no matter how objective the journalist, to tell those stories. And a great example of that is this week, launched The Killing Times, where we were trying to chronicle the history of massacres in Australia, which a lot of Australians don't know about. And it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Aboriginals killed during the colonisation of Australia, which we're mostly unaware of and definitely not really taught about in schools. And this week has been a really good example of us elevating Indigenous voices and listening to what they say, and their history, their version of history, because there is not one correct version of history, and for a long time that's what we were taught.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing that, right? Like, I feel like that's one of the shifts that have happened in the last few years is introducing new voices into the mix. So instead of worrying about like an objective take, if we encourage like a diversity, then the total might be objective or might be correct.
An objective take can come from Indigenous voice. Like, I think it's really odd also to somehow imply, as people do, that the Indigenous voice is biased. Like, our Indigenous Affairs editor is Indigenous herself, and the incredible stories and exclusives and news breaking she has brought to Guardian Australia just wouldn't have been able to be done by a white journalist, because they don't have the trust in the community and they don't have the deep historical knowledge.
So Maureen, I think that you kind of come from it from an interesting angle as well, because I think part of what we all do is how we still, with such in such charged times or with such divisive subjects, how do we still have a sense of unity? Like, how do we have a unified Australian story and Australian identity? Because I still think that's important to have, or to strive for at least.
Could I just first say what Bridie said? I so wholeheartedly agree with that. Aboriginal stories, Indigenous stories are best told from Indigenous people, and I think that's something we should do. Not speak on behalf of Indigenous people, but stand alongside and let Indigenous people speak for themselves. And I think that is changing, but still a bit slow. So all kudos to you, Bridie and The Guardian, for actually taking the lead on that. I think it's amazing. In terms of what Australia is, and I've learned in my 25 years that the strength of Australia is in its difference. When I came here, and obviously when you move from a country where generations and generations of your family have lived to another one, I think your desire, you have a burning desire to belong to this place. And for me, and I came here with my husband and my 1-year-old son, and then I have another daughter now. Initially, it was about, what is it to be an Australian? You have to eat Vegemite, for instance. I gave it a good go, but I'm sorry. I still prefer peanut butter, although that's not Pakistani either. Is it footy? You have to like, but no go for me as well, because I grew up in a country of cricket, but we did have some commonality there with Australia. That's with that struggle, is it a t-shirt with an Aboriginal flag you wear to feel more Australian? It's hard, and you explore all those things. The other thing that you do, which I did, is to stay quiet, is to not be a troublemaker, is to just take what's given to you. And we know Australia has a history of discrimination and racism, and of course the most brunt of it is still being felt by Aboriginal people, but other people like Monica, Bridie and myself aren't immune to that either. So, I kept quiet for a long time. But, there comes a time when you have to stand up and you have to be counted for yourself and for others who live in this country. So I think part of me making Australia a better place, because this is our home. I said that in my first speech to Parliament. This is my home, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm sorry, but not sorry for that. So, absolutely. And when I go back to Pakistan now, people do ask me this question, and I'm really ashamed that they've started asking me this question over the last some years. Why is Australia such a racist country? And part of the reason is because more of the media, what The Guardian is doing, what others are doing, is actually getting out now. I mean, that's the amazing thing about social media, that people are actually learning about the history that has been kept hidden for so many years. And what Scott Morrison is doing? He's actually changing history. And hiding history is also changing history. So I think unless we acknowledge that history, I think it's very difficult for us to move on as a united country. That's the first thing we have to do. And I think that's lacking in Australia. Like, anyone who talks about racism or discrimination to Aboriginal people is beaten down very quickly. And so I think that really worries me. But to do that, we have to raise our voices together. And that's started to happen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I'm going to turn this to a bit of a book club, because I've got your book here. But there was one particular quote by when you met Barkindji man Damien Kennedy, and talking about the Barker, so the Murray River, and
it's the Darling,
and
which a lot of you will know is suffering incredible. It's incredibly dry at the moment. Like ancient fish that have been there for like 100 years, 100 years old, 50 years, yes. Like huge fish that have seen, sort of survived so many droughts are dying at the moment, which is just disgusting.
Yeah, and he was talking about, not being interested in becoming rich. It's more about country needs to be rich, and we need, country to live. But the quote in particular I was quite just moved by he was saying that we all got to work together as Australians. He tells a lot of people that this is all our dreaming now. We've got to dream our river back to life because we all live here. So, it's about standing together and taking that responsibility, and I think moving beyond a lot of those sort of, people being put into boxes. I mean, what your work has really done is challenge that sort of essentialist view of culture where you see people in terms of being white, black, Asian. I mean, what if you have someone like me who's all three of them? And I mean,
it's not uncommon, your story.
I learned from your book.
There's Danny T.J. Johnson, he's here somewhere. He also has, Asian, European, and what's the third one? Indigenous, heritage, and that just sort of defies our understanding of what a typical Indigenous Australian or a typical Asian or a typical white Australian might look like.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's great, talking about giving voices to First Nations people, but through your book, you're giving voice to Australians with, multicultural backgrounds. So, having Asian heritage, being born in Australia as well. So, I really thank you for your perspective, and I think this work is very important for a lot of, particularly young people growing up from, multicultural background.
I wanted to add something that came up at this forum that Marika and I went to about Captain Cook and about how it was sort of in preparation, I guess, for next year and how Indigenous Australians might choose to respond to that event. And I thought what was really interesting was one of the panellists, Amrita Heppy, she talked about why even Captain Cook, because there are all these stories of our seafaring culture that are absolutely fascinating and they get marginalised. So, in my book, I look at the fact that Macassan fishermen from Indonesia have been trading with northern Indigenous Australian groups for hundreds of years before colonialism.
Yeah, up until the early 1900s. I mean, they never tried to take over Australia. I mean, this is why, there were visitors from other countries who would visit Aboriginal land and they would follow protocol, treat people with respect, and wouldn't just try and take places over. So it's about, not why should it be about, it's about colonisation, there's this thirst for taking over countries where, the argument we get is, if it wasn't the British, it'd be someone else. And it's like, well, not, it doesn't necessarily be that way, because you look at the Macassan example where people have been trading and dealing with one another in a respectful way. Yeah.
But divide and rule has been a particular philosophy of the British colonization. So I think that's what the legacy that we are living with now, the division that was left from that time.
Yeah, well, history is told from the victors, exactly, from the perspective of the victors. And really what happened was, after the White Australia policy was put to bed, Australia they turned that on its head, because that would have, things could have remained consistent had they chosen to stick with that, to stick with deciding that Australia was a white man's paradise. But by turning that on its head, it's actually got us into this wonderful quandary that we're in now, where we're not sure whose perspective we're supposed to come from, because that's just sort of disintegrated into so many different kinds of perspectives. And, I think that my book is one small contribution to sort of going, well, here's one person's feeling or attempts to, connect and find some kind of, connection to this place. I'm sort of obsessed by this idea of the everyman. So if none of you know what that is, it's a sort of literary term which is basically like in any book or film, you have the protagonist who's the stand-in for the audience, for the reader, and you're supposed to identify with this person. And because of the patriarchy and because of colonialism, in Australia, that person is usually, a straight white man. It is, I really hate sort of, using those essentialist kinds of terms, but that's the plane of it. And I find it really interesting if, can a Muslim female from Pakistan and a vegetarian be an Australian everyman? Do all of you think that that's possible? I'm talking about Marina here.
I think everything is possible, but I think the reality is we are a long way from there. I think you have to face that. I mean, I didn't realize, firstly, that I was only the 100th woman to enter the Australian Senate. It actually shocked me. It was the media who dug that out. I was only the 100th woman to enter the Senate. I mean, how crazy is that? And of course, the first Muslim woman. So looking at history, it seems that it will be a while before that happens. But do we actually need an every man or an every person? Like, I think that idea in itself should be challenged. Why can't we be satisfied with difference? You know, because that's what the world is shrinking, really. More and more we meet people who are quite different to us, look quite different to us, act different to us, but they are still people like every one of us. So I think I would like to challenge that notion of an everyman.
I've got this great story that Tony, who's part of the Greens, he told me that someone came up to him, he was in a Greens t-shirt, and said, "Oh yeah, Marie Faruqi, she's so great. It's so good to have someone like her in Parliament." And he was thinking, I wonder what he's referring to. And then he was like, an engineer.
That is refreshing to hear.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, that is a really encouraging step, If this person sees you as an engineer in Parliament, I think we're doing that.
I didn't even know that when I entered New South Wales Parliament, of course you don't think of these things, I was there for reasons other than, who I was in terms of religion or race, but it was the media who dug that out as well. And that's how I found out that I was the first Muslim woman to enter any parliament. But that's kind of immaterial in a sense. I mean, it is important in the sense of our parliaments lacking the diversity that lives on our streets and suburbs, but it's quite immaterial in the sense of, what I do in parliament.
So one of the things that I think has been a lesson for me over the last few years since I got back from my trip is thinking about power and privilege, and actually realising that I have a lot more of that than your average Australian. I think it was easy at The Guardian for me to fly my minority flag. It was almost encouraged as part of the job of the media, perhaps, or perhaps I revelled in that position. But I think my trip, and I think the experiences that I've had since I've come back, where I've tried to give back to the community, has really opened my eyes to, how much privilege that I have. And reading your book, really sort of, reading Bridie's book, The Way Things Should Be, sort of subtly brought that out for me too. You have this really great line where one of the characters who's white, and came, the characters in the book, I guess would be middle class or working class even, would you say?
Like lower middle class. It's fun to be middle class in the country. Like that's a complicated thing. I think
Right.
Australian regions. They weren't business owners, but yeah.
Yeah, and she has this great line where she's maybe a little bit drunk, and she says to this Asian character, "What do you think is more important or worse, race or class?" I'm butchering it. What was the line in that?
Hey, do you know how long ago?
Anyway,
no, you're not butchering it all. I remember. I know what you're writing about. What was it the bit where she says, "What's more important, race or class?" And then basically the point of it is everyone's quite privileged, and the person who feels that they came from a working class background will say class, and the person who comes from a minority racial background will say race, because they want to claim some kind of flag in that, and they don't recognise how privileged they are really in that moment.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that when we investigate the ways in which we are minority people, it's really important to remember your privilege as well, and to make use of that privilege to, be an ally to another group, and make sure that we're lifting all of us up together, not just thinking about ourselves or our family or our community, because we're all in it together. We're living in one country. We're living on one planet. We can't fuck this up. So I think that's been, I guess, the sequel for me in terms of my journey after this book has been really, getting to the heart of what it means to belong to a place, and how you need to give back. How it's not just about a right, it's about a responsibility as well. Can we do a time check? I stupidly didn't bring my...
It's 1:45.
It's 1:45, so with that, I want to wrap things up. I do want to say that after this I'm going to be signing books, so if you have your book, and you want it signed, I'm happy to do that. I'm definitely sign it for you, Maureen. Also, if there's no books, yes, please pre-order, get it online, go to a bookstore, go to a library. I want to get a drink after this, so please come join me for that. I want to decompress, so we're going to go to Newtown Hotel. Let's do that together. If you are coming to Newtown Hotel, please save your book for then, and I'll sign it then instead of doing it here. And just thank you so much to everyone who came out here. It really meant so much to me. I will never, ever, ever forget this night, so thank you.